Everybody, welcome. This is, I don't know how often we do film screenings. We've done them before, but it's pretty rare. And this is the first time we've had one that is so provocatively titled. We have with us the filmmakers themselves. Cassie Quarless is a producer and director with a background in comedy and documentary shorts. He's produced short-form content for The Wagon, Future Learn, and UCL. I guess that's University College London. Mm-hmm. Okay, UCL. Amongst others, he studied digital anthropology at University College London and has a strong interest in the imagining of and potential for radical futures. Usayd Younis, here, is a radical filmmaker. We're just discussing this notion of radical potential understanding. Radical filmmaker and digital editor for Ceasefire magazine. His first documentary, The Two Worlds, addresses the topic of inequality in post-apartheid South Africa. Usayd has facilitated workshops in arts and activism for Platform, Shake, and has a passion for social justice. Are you from South Africa?
No.
You just went there?
Just did that thing where you go and,
Yeah. Better than just going and eating food and seeing wildlife and stuff like that. Okay, so we just want to start with the film, and then we'll do Q&A afterwards, or do you want to say anything in the beginning?
we don't normally say too much. Thanks for all of you for coming. Thanks for having us. We've screened this film across the UK already, and we're now touring the US. We're really excited to be here, and we think we can do something interesting with the conversation as well. So we look forward to having a discussion afterwards. Okay. You guys
Thank you. It's the people who are doing well in the celebrities, the black in the UK, say the people in the music, entertainment, sports. So do they have any connection, or as a mentor, do they speak to these groups? The mentoring role
of the groups that are in the film, do you mean?
Yeah, or in general the disenfranchised, marginalized.
I think that's kind of been an interesting conversation in the UK actually about the role of prominent mentors within the black community, and I think in a lot of ways. I certainly feel that when I was growing up, there weren't necessarily that many, and I know that today a lot of young people still have a dearth of true role models, really. But I think with this film, what we kind of aim to show was that role models don't need to be prominent media people. They don't need to be in entertainment. They don't need to be in sports. They're people in your community. And I think that that's something that we wanted to drive home with this film, Generation Revolution, because obviously we wanted to show the stories of ordinary young people who kind of saw that the world around them wasn't necessarily what it could be. So they had this idealism and they had ideas about how they could change it, and they took it upon themselves to find other people who were as motivated as they were to basically try and change things. So we see them doing the homeless action, so going to hand out packages to homeless people. You see them going on protests. You see them teaching other people about stop and search, which obviously is something that's very similar to stop and frisk here. And what we hope to do is show that actually there are role models in your communities. So rather than looking outside there, looking at newspapers, looking at TV, looking at film, you can look around you and you can find those kinds of people that you're talking about.
Hi.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had an indication of what all non-black or ethnic minorities, their contribution to the actions.
So actually this film is not just made up of black people, it's black and brown people, so people of colour who make up the groups. There is a slightly different kind of, it's kind of hectic out there, isn't it? There is a slightly different kind of racial makeup in the UK. So I know that you might not necessarily have noticed, but a lot of those people have mixed identities as well. But that being said, there is still work to be done, and that is being done around involving other people of colour in the wider discourse around race. some communities are not as involved as others. And it's sort of parallel to how much they're affected by racism and the discrimination in the UK. But that being said, I think one of the things that all of these groups did was specifically to try and involve groups, people from different communities of colour in the organising that they were doing.
Question?
Well, I guess my question is similar in a sense. There's something that struck me about the movement or the actions in particular, which is something that we think a lot about here when we think about social change, is the question of intersectionality. And in moments it seemed to be happening in really quite an organic way. For a lot, I want to call them characters, I know they're not characters, but the protagonists, the people, are kind of arriving at some of these conclusions about where struggles converge. I wonder, I mean, what are your thoughts about the role of class struggle in the UK and sort of that history, which we have something of in North America as well, but there's less of a culture that's sort of built up around it. Do you think that there's something about the language and kind of history of class struggle in the UK that makes the intersection of issues of race and class kind of more palpable?
Well, I don't know if I can necessarily offer a comparative view, if you will, because I'm not as accustomed with the American environment, but I can definitely speak about the UK. And I mean, so the groups that we followed definitely embraced the idea of intersectionality, because some of them were young people who'd never been involved in organising, some of them were young people who'd been involved in other groups, so in socialist groups, as part of the white left, doing various things, and I think they had come to those conclusions before really we'd even started filming, that we can't just talk about race, that we can't just talk about class, that we can't just talk about gender or sexuality, we can't just talk about these things in isolation, that actually we need to recognise that we need to fight these things on the intersections, because actually as individuals we never live isolated lives. So we never live, I never live life just as a black man. I live as a black man, and then as part of my class position, and then my sexuality, and all of these things have an impact in which I'm perceived, in which I'm acted upon, and in which I'm able to act in the world. So in that sense, it was, I mean, I think intersectionality was kind of a massive common ground for all of them. Then, with regards to the history of class struggle in the UK, I think that was really interesting for us, because a lot of the groups that had kind of existed before, I mean, in the contemporary history, I mean, because obviously there were black struggle groups in the 70s and the 80s in the UK, and now we're really talking about the 2000s, so we started filming in 2014. A lot of the groups who were talking about widespread systemic change would be, I guess, more aligned to the traditional left. So they were talking about class, but they weren't necessarily talking about race in any significant way. So I think that these groups kind of came about in opposition to that, whereas they're like, yes, we recognize that class is a massive issue. In the UK, I think there is a strong history of class struggle. So when we look at a lot of the benefits that we've gotten with regards to, if we think about the weekends, we talk about working hours, the NHS, all of these different things. So the National Health Service, all these different things definitely came about through working class people and allies within the middle classes, etc., who fought for these things. So there was a recognition of this history, but there was also a really strong recognition, or I guess there was a request for people to recognize that all these other issues, so race and gender, for example, needed to be brought into the conversation. And I think these groups, because they recognise that other people weren't going to do it for them, that they needed to take it upon themselves for it to be part of their discussion and their narrative, really.
Well, first of all, it was really immersive experience. So
The two questions. One, what was the problem? What was Arnie's problem? What did he do wrong? They reacted against. How is that different from what was happening in the last scene at Heathrow Airport? And two is how much is this, especially the second half of the movie, about rumination about this, like, politics of respectability versus. I mean, that's certainly, as far as I understand, the Black Lives Matter in this country is very much opposed to sort of politics of respectability in the kind of classical ways that have been, the church going feeding the homeless. And so, how is that kind of debate going on in this movie as well?
I think we see these characters as sort of personifications of ideas. So in many respects, Arnie represents something that is a sort of a recognized struggle that has happened in organizing and in groups and in movements throughout time, which is that there is a struggle internally around hierarchy, firstly. So I think with him and the group, there was definitely an attempt to sort of decentralize this organization and make it so it was a non-hierarchical space. And I think somebody like him, that he was sort of quite resistive to that. And also the directions in which the kind of organizing was going in, so tactically, do we want to organize around police violence, solely, or are we trying to include migrants? Are we trying to organize around, a kind of plethora of different issues? So it wasn't just one thing, but I think part of it was ultimately about power. And I think, we're not trying to sort of prescribe ideas with this film, rather to draw light to the fact that these sort of things will happen. Ultimately, like, what we were trying to do was make a film that could inspire young people of color in particular towards activism. But also doing so, this is the story that we encountered, and we felt it was super important for us to relay that these are the kind of things you may be up against. Rather than making a piece which is all glamorous and it's going to be great and you're going to love it, sure, there were amazing moments of camaraderie. There's such a great feeling of, power that you can affect change, and all of those things are amazing. But also, you will be met with characters who are going to have a different view of the world and have a different idea about organizing. So it wasn't just the kind of deployment of sort of more radical edge of tactics, but also the methodology in which you go about it. So I think that was part of the problem. It was less about the so-called violence, or what the state would brand as violence. So blocking a highway isn't really violent, but they would describe it as such. But rather, are you including your collective in that? Is this a kind of group decision? Are we making, are we even making decisions collectively? And so those kind of things, which are sort of more in the nuances in the kind of discussions that was taking place. So I think that's kind of, hope that answers some of that question. Do you want to talk to the?
And can you repeat the second? So the second part of the question was.
I guess I sort of got the sense that there was this tension between kind of the clash, sort of kind of clash that would result in violence versus the young lady who is sort of being like, I want to go to church and feed the homeless. I don't want to, or I mean that's kind of radical versus non-radical.
I think Ted would probably, so the character that you're talking about, would probably say that that's not what she meant necessarily. I don't think she was saying that she would rather be part of a church group giving out packages to the homeless, etc. It's actually, I think it was really to do with the particular tactics and having, I guess, putting thought into what they were doing, because I think at the time when the Black Revs kind of dissolved, when Arnie kicked everybody out, there was this sense that what their actions weren't necessarily rooted in this idea of what it was meant to achieve, and I think that's what she was kind of talking about. So I think a better contrast would actually be with what our movement did, because they did basically the same thing. They went to hand out packages to homeless people as well, but they weren't necessarily adhering to this idea of respectability politics. It was more grounded in ideas about solidarity with homeless people. So we're going to go, we can't do that much because we're 17, we're 18, but at least we can show these people that we still view them as human, even though the rest of society doesn't. And I think that that's the kind of dynamic that she's talking about, more than respectability politics, because I think that both groups really would reject that, in the sense of like, as black and brown people, we have to act in a certain way to be accepted by the wider society. I don't think that that was necessarily an idea that anyone that we really followed would adhere to.
I was just wondering if you had heard them talk about going further than just marching. I mean, did they consider, going to businesses, going to corporations, raising some money, and then really making an impact in the government? Like we do here in this country when we're community. I mean, I'm a community organizer myself, and we do things like I go to city council, I talk to the people in city council, I try to get in and see the mayor, with what I'm working on. And I just wondered if they had thought beyond the march to getting some attention that way.
Well, it's interesting right at the end there,
Here, but Josh was saying this is going to go so much further, to the point where we're going to have big man in Whitehall, it was a man at the time, i.e. the Prime Minister, at a place where he has to answer questions on do Black Lives Matter. So clearly it is part of their agenda. But I think it's about the terms whose terms is that conversation taking place on. And so this is why they're saying we need to be seen out here on the streets, we need to be seen to be, we're not just gonna accept this, we're not just gonna kind of lie down and take it. We're gonna disrupt, we're gonna cause, we're gonna draw attention to our struggle. And I think that is definitely it's a grassroots movement. It's a movement which sees itself as being part of the communities and trying to represent the community's needs. And so I think I understand that kind of long-term plan is something that makes a lot of sense, but I think that they also see it from a critical perspective and don't necessarily think that going straight to kind of government and local councils and all of that kind of thing has necessarily been a very successful tactic that has worked in the UK in the past. A lot of those people are seen as people who've been subsumed by the system rather than people who are really challenging it from the inside.
So actually, I think towards the end, Josh mentions among the struggles which they have to look to face up to in the future. He mentioned prevent, and I just thought maybe a few words to the struggles who might be less familiar with what prevent is about. Yeah, do you want to?
Yes, prevent means preventing violent extremism. It's similar to the CVE.
It's actually the basis for the US CVE. It's pretty much based on UK.
Pretty much based on prevent. Well, yeah, and it's an extremely regressive sort of policy. It targets the Muslim community in particular. It's pretty much unashamedly so. It's been used, for example, for on children at schools as young as 5, who've drawn a picture of someone with a gun or something, and they've been reported to prevent, and it's mothers have been deprived of having access to their children for hours while they're being questioned by the police. And so what's really interesting, and I think it's a great thing that you've mentioned that, because and obviously it's completely relevant to this space as well, is how is the Muslim community and how are communities like that addressing this in this way. And clearly it's part of the kind of wider discourse in communities of color who are rising up. They are definitely including government policy which directly targets one community as part of their struggle, and I think that's a really promising thing. It's also happening on multiple levels, so we can't avoid the fact that there are different groups who are attempting to address prevent, and some of them are benefiting from it as well. So you have, and this is again, it's exactly the same in the US, you have organizations who the government is effectively bankrolling to deploy their policies of preventing so-called extremism. And it's so those groups are being kind of outed as well, and people are definitely kind of engaging in a critical discourse around what it means to prevent extremism amongst one community. But yeah, it's had a pretty devastating effect
In terms of organising, because I know, like again, like you mentioned, groups which are being sponsored by the government, you have a few organisations which are receiving prevent funding, which are set up as anti-racist or anti-discrimination or anti-Islamophobia, but in fact, a lot of what they're doing is very progressive, like you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, it's difficult to see because a lot of Muslim communities are effectively being sort of undercut by these groups who claim to kind of be representing them and their interests, but are actually, far from it. So you'll have kind of government. I was actually watching a parliament session, and one of these groups was in attendance, sort of in contrast to the kind of more recognized established Muslim council. And they were happily condemning every kind of remotely Islamist Muslim group that exists, and so then we have to start talking about foreign policy and all of these things, and immediately those are all out. The conversations around those things are out of the window because it all fits in within this agenda. So it's really about shutting down critical discourse, and I think that's the biggest problem.
One of the things I think that's really important about this film is I think it demonstrates kind of beautifully how art can be a powerful force in social change. And this is just a spectacularly well-made film. At the level of sound, at the level of editing, at the level of pacing, at the level of bringing character out, the level of storytelling. I'm not really building to a question so much as an expression of admiration. But I think this is positioned really well to help also young artists engage with these issues in a way that can get voices spread widely. And I just thank you. Admiration.
Yeah, and I guess to jump on that point, it was really important for us also not to be making a film. So obviously we see ourselves as activist filmmakers, but it was really important in the making of Generation Revolution to not be the activist filmmakers, if that makes sense. Like the activists making a film about other activists. I think that can get really clouded. Like this film was our activism. And it was really important for us in the process of making the film, actually, to maintain that distance, to be able to make a film that would be approachable to a broader audience. Because I think a lot of times with activist films, sometimes we're speaking to the converted, and then it turns off a lot of people. Whereas with this film, we really wanted to bring in a lot of young people who weren't necessarily already involved in their communities, who weren't already doing work, to kind of show them that it was something that was, it's difficult, but it's something that other young people who are just like them, who are just as human and as fallible as they are, were doing. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you for your film. I think it was inspirational, which is what you hope to do, and or one of the things that you hope to do, and instructive also. I have a couple of questions. One is about the concept of grassroots organizing. So at one point, especially when the French woman is talking at one of the demonstrations saying, we're all going to break down, we're going to talk because we're not telling you what to do, we're deciding what to do together. And I'm just sort of, there's always a tension with that. And it's somewhat, in some ways, almost disingenuous, though it seems like it's true, but then you wonder, and you look at the group itself and see what happened with Arnie and all of that. It wasn't a collective if one person can make a decision. So that whole sort of thing I'd be interested in a little more. Also, as somebody who was an activist in the 60s, I wonder if some people are now, from an academic point of view, looking at the question of how and why do revolutions die, which I think is a really important question. So I wonder if at all you are bringing into conversation these young activists with older activists who've been down that path, who've had those failures, who've had those successes, and I wonder if there's any way to bring that into conversation.
Well, they're both really good questions, thank you. And we've had a lot of discussions about, particularly the latter. It often comes up in screenings, particularly from the older generation, who ask, well, have these young people not seen what we went through? And the truth is, they haven't. And this is something that we've been saying to people from the older generation. You sort of failed to demonstrate these things in a medium like this, which was accessible to those people, so that they could say, well, actually, those are some things we could actually avoid. And I think that that's a difficult thing for some people to grasp or grapple with. But I think that some elders have also admitted that, yeah, we did actually fail to pass down that information. Because oftentimes it's seen as a duty on these young people, some of them extremely young, to have a great understanding of their historical context. And so what we're trying to achieve with this film is actually to create a document so that the future generation will be able to see what was happening before. And it's just a shame that there aren't as accessible pieces as this. We've engaged with a lot of Black British media, like from the archives, and it's really hard to get a hold of.
Is there any one like obscure documentary that someone put on the internet
that you could get about the UK?
I mean, but that, you know, you're talking about this sort of documenting the lessons, something like this that was made in 1970 or something like that. Is there nothing that's survived?
Well, there are a few. There's what's it called again? Blood That Go Run by Menelik Shabazz. So he's a Black British filmmaker. He made that in the 80s. So that was following. So there was this big fire in the UK. It was called the New Cross Fire in 1981. Was it 1981 or 1985? No, I think it was 81. Because and then that was Brixton riots and everything, right? So a suspected neo-Nazi group basically burnt down a house in which there was a birthday party going on for a young black woman, so a 16-year-old, I think it was. So there were her brothers, there were her friends, all of them died. And that kind of ignited, it was kind of the spark for a pretty big movement in the UK, so a movement for Black Lives really in the UK. So we had the Black People's Day of Action, and then we had there were the Brixton riots and the Toxteth riots and all these kind of things that happened following that. And Menelik Shabazz, with his film, he kind of spoke to the environment that kind of led to this, but also about the events and the resistant movement that kind of emerged from there. But the problem with that is that although these kind of documents do exist, they're really hard to get to because, as Usayd was saying, a lot of the times people make them and then they get bogged down in ideas about licensing and like, oh, if you guys aren't going to pay me for it, I'm not going to put it on the internet, I'm not going to put it out there. So what happens is that there are people who made films with varying levels of professionalism about what was going on at the time, but these things aren't necessarily accessible to people of our generation. And I know certainly in the making of Generation Revolution, that was something that we were really keen to do. We wanted to engage with the history, but it was actually really difficult. Like, again, I can't really speak for the American context, but in the UK, that was certainly what we felt, was that we kind of knew that there were things that had happened in the past, but it was really hard for us to actually engage with it. And even I think we went above and beyond trying to talk to people and get this information, and it was still really difficult. And it kind of goes back to Usayd's point about the onus being on us as the generation coming up, whose burden it is to know about the history, whereas it, as you rightly pointed out, it does need to be a dialogue. And a lot of the times for us, I feel like it was us going forward, and we weren't necessarily because we can't know what we don't know, if that makes sense. So we can only ask questions about things that we know about. But I know that there's a massive wealth of activist history, but also about the history of the documenting of what was happening that we're not privy to, really.
And on your first question about how genuine is so-called grassroots organizing, I think that's a really interesting question, and you could have a whole sort of panel on that. But I will say that there is a genuine desire to engage with the grassroots, and that is a really important thing. And so a lot of these young people were going out of their way to find out what community organizing really means, and we just captured a snapshot of their journey. You know, so the things that they learn from this will be lifelong lessons, you know, that you will meet characters like Arnie, and that you will have to grapple with that. And also, you know, is your organizing really speaking to the audiences that you claim to be speaking for? But I think the fact that they're having that conversation, that they're at 18 years old questioning how hypermasculinity has affected their lives, for example, I think that's a super progressive thing to experience. It's an amazing thing to witness, and I think it's quite encouraging. And so for us, you know, seeing that and seeing them really grappling with these things, as opposed to just writing it off as, oh well, you know, we're just doing it and we're going to get on with it, I think that's encouraging because it means that the movement will be richer for it in the end.
Well, I think that self-education and discussion is great, which was also a part of the 60s. I mean, was very, very big. And then it grew to actually larger levels of big, huge teach-ins and things like that, and how important that is. So, I mean, I think education, is part of a grassroots movement. But again, thank you for the film. It's just wonderful.
Thank you.
Probably coming up on the next class time. Thanks a lot, guys. This is I can't wait for this to be, I hope, available for a very wide audience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.